Hi, I'm Katie Venozzi,
I'm Olivia Seal.
and today we're going to be discussing the mandatory minimum penalties put on drug offenses in the criminal justice system. So, to start off, the social problem, basically, the mandatory minimum is just a sentencing law in general that forces a judge to hand down a minimum prison sentence based on the charges a prosecutor brings against a defendant, which results in a specific conviction. So this all started back when Len Bias died and he was left to die. So this expedited the passage of the Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986, which established the basic framework of the mandatory minimum penalties and how they were applicable to these federal drug offenses. So, for instance, just specific things that the act imposed, they imposed a mandatory minimum sentence of 5 years for possession with intent to distribute one of the following. It could be 5 grams of cocaine base, which is also known as rock cocaine, 500 grams of cocaine, 100 grams of heroin, or 100 kilograms of marijuana. So this leads to have the same consequences for single trip drug carriers and the ringleader who basically arranges all the shipments to the organization and their distribution. So foundations of these policies were grounded in fairness because basically the law enforcement just wanted all individuals to be convicted of the same sentence regardless of the circumstances of the defendant and their situation. So to break it down a little bit further, the policy objectives targeted were to be able to control crime and move away from the rehabilitative model. So it created a more certain, less desperate, and more appropriately punitive sentence, which was a model which was basically set in stone with no give or leeway about the consequences regarding the defendant's situation. So an outcome of that was that mandatory minimums were presented, and it made both liberals and the conservatives happy because the liberals believed that the mandatory minimums would lead to the less desperate sentencing on the part of the federal judges, especially when you're going against minorities, while the conservatives were happy because they appreciated the tough on crime nature of the new penalties. Another outcome was that more than half, 52.8% of offenders that were convicted of a drug offense carried the mandatory minimum and faced that minimum penalty of 10 years or greater. As for the consequences, an overt consequence was that the mandatory minimum penalty continued to have a significant impact on the size and composition of the federal prison population because half, 49.8% of all the federal inmates were drug offenders, and 3/4 of those offenders were convicted of a drug carrying the mandatory minimum. Another one is that statutory relief appears to provide a significant incentive for those drug offenders to cooperate with the government because when those drug offenders that were convicted of offense carrying a mandatory minimum, they were twice as likely to provide assistance to the law enforcement and the government than those offenders that were not convicted of such offense. A covert outcome was that since many individuals are placed in the system for minor drug offenses, and they're also required to serve the minimum sentence without a chance to kind of state their plea. And again, in general, imprisonment is just too high in general, but Congress also set the drug weight way too low for those thresholds, so it didn't really give people any leeway with anything. Another covert is, although likely due in part to the older age when they're released from prison, those drug offenders that were convicted of offense of carrying the mandatory minimum were also less likely to be reoffended than the drug offenders that were not convicted of such offense.
So this policy was put in place to stop widespread drug distribution, which can help support families by limiting drugs on the street and improving society as a whole. With the major traffickers off of the street, it would lessen the frequency of distribution and prevent the hardships that families often face with addiction. So some of the personal stories that we found relating to this issue, there was one journalist who talked about her brother who had been arrested a few years back for growing marijuana. She found out that between the federal sentencing guidelines and the mandatory sentences, he had to serve 5 years in prison without parole. The judge ultimately said that he did not want to sentence him to 5 years, but by law he had to. And the journalist ultimately considered herself and her brother lucky because 5 years is nothing compared to the people who are often given 10, 15, up to life sentences in prison for nonviolent first-time drug offenses. Another journalist touched on the subject of women who are often incarcerated for drug offenses, women being the wives, mothers, sisters, daughters, everyone who become involved in crimes because of either their financial dependence on, their fear of, or their romantic relations with a male drug trafficker. They're often referred to as women of circumstance, and they also often find themselves incarcerated and subject to draconian sentences because the men in their lives persuade, force, or trick them into carrying drugs. Even over the past 30 years, the number of women in state and federal prisons has increased over 8 times the amount of women that were incarcerated in 1980 for drug trafficking crimes. There was also a statement of Judge Mark Bennett. He does not agree with the mandatory minimum sentences. He said that they are so incredibly harsh and they've triggered by such low levels of drugs that they snare at these nonviolent low-level addicts who are involved in drug distribution mostly to obtain drugs to feed their habit. He looks at it as more of a medical problem, being addiction, and the fact that they're going to be faced with 5 and 10 and 20 years, and sometimes even life mandatory minimum sentences for addiction, he quotes as a travesty. So there are different ways to improve this policy. Congress has even said that we're supposed to look at the nature and circumstances of the offense and the history and characteristics of the defendant. And it's definitely important to go back and look at the history of the mandatory minimums. It's very interesting because when this bill was passed, there was not even a single congressional hearing. There was no federal judge called to testify, not a single person from the Federal Bureau of Prisons. Basically, there were just no professionals involved in the making of this policy, and they basically picked the mandatory minimums and the drug quantities literally out of thin air. So we think that mental health should be a big focus for this. So before providing mandatory minimum sentences, I think that they need to go back and look into the mental health evaluations and background checks on these individuals. They should be able to have personal testimonies of the character of the defendant from family members or friends or bosses that might know these people that could testify towards their character rather than if they just had some amount of drug on them and they were sentenced to this long in prison. I think it would be really helpful to reassess the minimum sentences and the drug quantities accordingly and make it a little bit more fair and equal. It would also, to provide funding for this, they need to reassess those who are already imprisoned unfairly due to drug charges and release those who were convicted for minimum sentences where the consequences that they were in did not meet the sentence. With a downsize in the prison population by doing this, there would be less individuals in the system, and this would leave more funds to be directly given to the needs of those individuals, whether that be mental health care or other medical care that they might need. The way to provide the mental health evaluations for each of these defendants, it should just be gone about as the same way as a court-appointed lawyer. If you're given a court-appointed lawyer, there should also be a court-appointed mental health specialist as well. They would be funded by the state just like the lawyers are, where the individual is convicted, and they would assess the individual and decide what type of treatment is needed, whether it be rehabilitative services or to be incarcerated. And yeah, I don't know what to say about that.